So if this works and we do the build out, that is inflationary too. And we will have inflation of 9 to 15% for 5 years, but we will be accompanied by near record growth. If we fail to do the build out, we get all of the inflation and none of the growth, and it is not over in 5 years. So I'm not too concerned because it's just so obvious, but it should be obvious to the White House press corps as well, and it is not. Longer term, ruling out for the moment a general nuclear exchange, which I see as exceedingly low. I think the biggest long-term threat we will have is what happens when you do have a series of breakdowns around the world that shatters global manufacturing and energy and transport and agriculture. The world that emerges from that is going to be a chaotic, somewhat Darwinian place. And in that sort of environment, our problem is not someone like the United States electing somebody like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Our problem is when a significant ethnicity or series of countries elect their version of populists. This is how we get the next Joe Stalin. This is how we get the next Mao Zedong or the next Adolf Hitler or the next Pol Pot. I am very concerned about what happens to a world that deglobalizes and the U.S. just doesn't care. I don't have a fix for you here. The United States gets engaged for one of two reasons. We see opportunity or we get scared. There's opportunity here. There is a way for the United States to remake the global condition, to remake the human condition. We've got the capacity, we've got the reach, we just don't have the bandwidth at home. And if we can rebuild that bandwidth, if we can get through this political reshuffling that we're going through right now, then hopefully we can beat the global collapse and come up with a new vision, have a conversation about what we want. But if we fail, massive global degradation is the only way forward here. And people will take advantage of that, and we will not like how they do that. Let me take Canada down a half a notch, and then we'll go into the positives. Canada does have great rocks. Unfortunately, the really good rocks are nowhere near where they're needed. And the problem has always been the capital investment to build the mines and get the stuff out. Now, in a globalized world where you're competing with Australia and Brazil and South Africa, Canada oftentimes didn't do great, and so a lot of Canadian mining companies have had to up and leave to other production zones in other countries. I expect a lot of that to reverse in the world we're going into, because if it's a choice between high production costs or not having the material, that moves the needle. So Canada is going to be able to take advantage of a lot of the technological advances we've seen in the mining space over the last 30 years, in many cases for the first time. And the only restriction on Canadian output will be the restrictions that the Canadians decide themselves. So you get to have that conversation with your provincial and your federal governments. Have fun with that. I'm sure it's going to be a hoot because we all know how difficult that can be no matter where you are. Now, I am not a CFA. I don't want to tell you what you should do with your portfolio, but things I see that are just slam dunks. If the demand for the product is demographically driven, well, the United States has the world's slowest aging demography, and Mexico is the healthiest demography of the advanced industrial world. So, in North America, you've got a solid consumption base that will continue to grow even without inward immigration, which I think will increase once we get past through this phase where we hate everybody. In terms of commodities, we know that most Russian oil is going to fall off the market. The stuff that goes to Europe comes from Western Siberia, and it's produced in the permafrost. And the second that is shut down, the wells start to crack and you don't reopen them. The stuff in Eastern Siberia wasn't done by the Russians. It was done by Western companies who are no longer there. So that stuff's going to zero. Whether or not that happens in 3 months or 6 months or 3 years, I don't know. We've never had to deal with this before. A lot of the oil production that is in places like the Middle East is not what we would call stable, especially with the United States no longer part of the conversation. So to think that you could have access to oil, and if you have the ability to bring it to market, that seems to kind of be a slam dunk from my point of view. The trick, of course, is getting it to market. If you want to do it in the lowest carbon intensive way, I realize that this is like heresy to some Canadians and some Americans, and especially the Green Movement. But the best way to do that is to pipe it to Texas where the refineries already exist. So you don't have to build any more industrial plant than you already have to do. I would like to think that that conversation is going to be reopened in the next year when it becomes apparent just how bad the global shortage is going to be. But ultimately, I think the economic sector, especially in Canada, that is going to expand the most explosively and sustainably is going to be agriculture. If you remove former Soviet potash from the market, all that is left is Canada. And Canada has enough to supply the United States, but not a lot else. And we are going to have chronic, crippling potash and phosphorus, potash and phosphate shortages in Australia, in Africa, in Brazil, and in South Asia. And that is going to have a horrific impact on our ability to grow staples. The crop that is likely to suffer the most in terms of overall output is wheat. Two things going on there. Number one, a lot comes from the former Soviet world. That's going to go away. And then second, wheat's a weed. We only grow it where we can't grow anything else. And in a world where deglobalization becomes more and more entrenched by the month, that means countries are going to have to start growing wheat not on their marginal land, but on their better land in order to feed their own populations. That doesn't just mean a collapse of global agricultural trade at volume and into the diversity we've become used to. It means that we're going to have massive wheat shortages because a lot of that wheat right now isn't just grown in marginal zones. It's grown in marginal zones that can only be brought into cultivation with industrial level technologies and inputs. And if that goes away, you're looking at catastrophic reductions out of production everywhere in the world except the United States and Canada. And so wheat goes from being very, very boring to being the sexiest market play out there. I think the general thesis is unfortunately very sound. The United States, we adventure into the world when we see opportunity or when we feel fear. And it's kind of a crapshoot as to which it is. So Spanish-American War was opportunity. World War I, War II, that was fear. Cold War, that was fear. The 19th expansion was opportunity. We're probably in a period now where we're kind of on the knife edge and go either direction. So I don't know what it would be, but if there is a threat, that is absolutely one of the dominant ways where the United States does decide to re-engage. And because the U.S. economy is held locally, but the U.S. military is the most powerful and has the most reach, how we re-engage, how we react to that fear drives global developments for at least a generation. The last time it happened, it was the war on terror, which turned the Middle East upside down. Middle East may never recover from the damage that we did as a side effect of our panic attack. So absolutely reasonable concern. Taiwan specifically, I'm not so concerned about. One of the weird things that has happened in China in the last few years is the consolidation of Xi Jinping's cult of personality to the degree that there is now no one left in the country that is capable of acting on independent thought. Everyone has either been intimidated into silence or executed or exiled, and it's just him to the degree that no one wants to bring him news. I think the best example of that happened back in February when we had the Olympics. And Putin was there, and Xi asked Putin to his face if he was planning on invading Ukraine. And Putin just said flat out, no, of course not. And people in Xi's entourage from the intelligence community just bit their tongues because they knew it was a lie, but they didn't dare tell their boss because they didn't know how he would react because he killed so many of his messengers. They didn't want to be the next one. So Xi is not getting basic information about what's going on in the world or even his own country. And we're seeing things like this COVID lockdown policy that are just leading to systemic failures up and down the entire bureaucracy because no one wants to act. They're terrified. And in that sort of environment, this is normally where you'd have a change in plan because the Chinese, who are smart, are looking at Russia and realizing how badly this is going. And when they try to put themselves in the Russians' shoes, they don't like what it looks like. They now know that if they try a war with Taiwan, it would not be quick. It would not be easy. The Taiwanese have been preparing for this war for 70 years, and they have a moat. You can walk from Moscow to Kyiv. So the Chinese would not be able to bring the numbers to bear. They now have severe doubts about the weapon systems that they've copied or bought from the Russians. So everything that they thought from a military point of view is proving to be wrong. 40 years of military planning has gone out the window. And then there's the sanctions and the boycotts. Russia isn't a great economy, but it's a huge exporter of food and energy. China imports that stuff. In fact, they import like 3/4 of their oil and about 3/4 of the components that are necessary for them to grow their food. So if you take a Russia-style sanctions package and put it against Beijing, you have the country deindustrialized in under a year.